Right, let's stay with education. According to the United Nations, education is a valuable basic human right for every society to progress and advance. It adds that the education not only empowers recipients but provides dignity and self-respect. To expand further on this critical and basic human right, we are now joined by Pearl Nicodemus, Senior Communications Officer at Section27. Pearl, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time tonight here on In Focus. Let's start here. I mean, define access for us. What do we interpret as access as far as education is concerned? I mean, the normal definition would say access would mean we have equal opportunity to education regardless of social class, race, gender, sexuality, ethnic background, physical or mental disability. Is that where we are? And would you say we cover all those touch points?
Thank you very much, and good evening to your viewers. I think that's precisely the definition of access to education, or equal access. But also what differentiates then becomes access to quality of education. And I would say, like you said, I think we're still a bit far off, because while the School Act of 1996 makes general education or basic education compulsory, and also the introduction of fee-free schooling in the early 2000s made access to education much easier. But we do see, according to data, that the closer people get to higher grades, the more they drop out. So, and I think we've heard these stats before, that the learners who start off in grade 1 don't make it all the way to matric. And there's a number of reasons for that. And that speaks to your question on access. So there's the cost of education, there's pregnancy of learners that stand as barricades, particularly in such an unequal society as ours. There's a wealth gap in this country, so it definitely does mean that the poorer population don't have access to quality education, to the kind of education that adequately prepares them, for life outside of school. Yeah.
So we'll talk about that in a moment, but let's go back a little bit and talk about then the interpretation of equity. According to Section 27, what is fair and what is just?
Fair and just is when every learner, like you've just said, irrespective of your background, irrespective of, your wealth status, you're able to access good quality education. And so there shouldn't be societal barricades or anything that sets you apart. So as it stands, we have, people in much better economic or socioeconomic who fare better because to better quality education, and so education that is accessible to learners. So I think that would be sort of the basic definition of equity, not having any socioeconomic issues or barricades stand in the way of getting quality education.
Yeah. So how do you then perceive our current standing in terms of equal allocation of resources? By resources, I mean funding, I mean teaching, I mean staff time that is allocated to every learner. And when you look, for example, at the wealthier schools compared to previously disadvantaged schools?
I think, we just come from the budget speech not so long ago. And what has been the trend is there has been cuts to socioeconomic spending. So that means that there's been cuts to, public spend. There's been cuts to public schooling and public health care. And so that has made it increasingly difficult, to reach a place where there's equity or even equal access to quality education. And Section 27 has been advocating, against these cuts to social spend, because these cuts definitely affect, people who don't have access to private schools, who don't have access to better quality education. And so that's what we've been advocating for government to allocate more funds to public schooling. You cannot cut public spend and say that you are adequately addressing, inequality in the country. Although education was allocated, slightly more of a budget, but then when you look at inflation, it does, the increase does not match up with inflation. So in real time, it's still a bit of a cut. So I think that's where we stand as an organization, to say that there needs to be adequate allocation according to the needs of the country.
As you mentioned that, I mean, are you saying to us there is no consideration, for example, in the allocation? Of course, allocation is one thing, but in the distributed amount eventually that gets to the schools, is there no consideration of the historical pre-existing factors that would affect those particular communities?
It's very hard, to affirmatively say there's no consideration. There is, because that then other factors that come into play. So even with budgets that are allocated, there are issues, for example, of underspending. We just saw recently there was a report that the Eastern Cape Department of Education had to forfeit, I think, something like 100 million of money that was intended for infrastructure. And so there are multiple factors that contribute to where we are as a country. So, while we are calling for, more allocation, but then we also then see further issues where there is whatever, little allocation or however amount is allocated, then there are further issues of, no quality spend or money is being returned. So there are multiple factors that contribute to where we are.
Yeah. You mentioned the issue of cost to access, right? Is there any evidence that we have on the ground that would suggest that government schools are fully adherent to legislation as far as fees and access is concerned?
Sorry, I just missed that. Can you just repeat?
I'm saying, is there any evidence that we can point to that says government schools are adherent to legislation as far as fees and access are concerned?
Yeah, government schools are, divided into, different categories. There are fee-free schools, and then, there are, depending on, socioeconomic background of the area or the school, so they are divided in that way, and they do adhere, to legislation. But then also, like I said, I think I just mentioned, there are certain issues, that I cannot speak into at the moment, but there are challenges within public schoolings when there is resource allocation.
Yeah. So, for example, we heard during the enrollment now at the beginning of the year, some schools, I think in Limpopo, were complaining around a decision that was taken by the school governing body, I think, to collect 500 rands. I don't know whether it was for cleaning of the facility or it was to pay security, something of that nature, and children being prevented from enrolling if they did not pay that amount of money. Are these matters being attended to?
In those cases, I don't think legally schools are allowed to do that, particularly if it's schools that are allocated as fee-free schools. So we've not received those types of queries, but I don't think that schools are allowed to. So what we do as Section 27 is we've developed a resource, a handbook that helps schools and the schooling community, parents, SGBs, to say this is what the law says. And we would encourage people to go to Section 27 website and look at this handbook. I don't think the law allows schools to one, demand that kind of money, and two, deny learners access based on their ability or inability to pay school fees. So they're definitely not allowed to. But I would further encourage the schooling community, schooling governing bodies, or parents to find out what the law says, or go to the Section 27 website and get our handbook. And in spaces where there's discrimination, in spaces where learners' right to education is being denied, especially on those grounds, they could contact us, but they're not allowed to do that.
As we wrap up the conversation, school attendance versus out-of-school youth, how do we fare?
Sorry, can you just repeat
that? I'm saying school attendance versus youth who are out of school, how do we fare as a country?
School attended versus youth who are out of school?
Yes.
Is that the question?
Yes. How do we fare? How are we looking?
I mean, the conversation, like we've just heard in the clip, the conversation of youth who are out of school is not very encouraging at the moment in the country, because even for learners so there's a big issue of dropouts that we're advocating against as civil society, but also then there's the issue of those who do make it out of school because of various factors. They don't either find employment, or they're despondent, or don't have enough space in higher learning institutions. And so there is quite a crisis in the country, and we believe that it should be attacked from basic education level. If we have an advocate for quality education, it perhaps will change the trajectory of what happens to learners when they leave school. They will be better prepared and better equipped, to one, deal with life out of school, and also to deal with the inequalities, unfortunately, that we are faced with as a country.
Pearl Nicodemus, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on tonight. Section 27's Senior Communications Officer there.